The Boy Who Brought Light, a story of love and transformation, you know. Not every home is filled with life, laughter, or movement. Some houses carry a silence so heavy that it seems to fill every corner. It was like that in the home of Milena and Enrique. Milena had been bedridden for months. A degenerative disease had taken over her body, robbing her of the ability to move, to get up, and even to feel the warmth of the sun on her skin. The only thing left was her voice, a weak voice that she used to thank Enrique for being by her side, even when everything seemed lost. Before the illness, Milena was a very active woman. She worked, went to the gym, loved to travel and discover new places. It was during one of those trips that she met Enrique. While sitting in a beach chair soaking up the sun, she spotted that clumsy man carrying an umbrella and a cooler, looking for a place to settle. That day, Milena approached him, offering help so he could set up and enjoy some sun, and they never let go of each other again. Enrique was a simple man, but with a giant heart. He did everything for Milena, prepared her meals, arranged her pillows, and always smiled at her, even when exhaustion seemed to crush his soul. It's true that Enrique felt very lonely, as Milena was no longer willing to talk, and so their conversations became more of a monologue. Enrique would tell Milena about his day, discuss politics, and mention something he had seen on the news. Milena rarely reacted. In fact, Enrique didn't even know if she was paying attention to what he was saying, yet he continued the same routine every day. Many times, Enrique thought, a little sadly, that if they had had children, life wouldn't be so empty, but Milena had always been adamant about that. She had no patience for children and wouldn't have any. Enrique, on the other hand, had always liked children, but his love for Milena made him accept it as it was. That morning, like so many others, Enrique opened the curtains to let the sun in. He knew Milena didn't like it much, but he did it to remind her that there was still a world outside. "It's cold today, Enrique," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled, trying to hide the pain he felt seeing her in that state. "A little sunshine is good for you, Milena. I'll let it in just a little, okay?" She didn't respond. She just turned her face to the side, as she always did when she wanted to avoid any discussion. Enrique watched her for a moment and then leaned down to kiss her forehead. "I need to go to work, but I'll be back soon, okay? I love you." With that, he left, closing the door gently behind him. Now, just imagine a man who loves his wife so much, but who, every day, has to leave her alone, knowing she lives surrounded by a painful silence. How would you deal with that? As he walked through the busy streets, Enrique tried to push away his sad thoughts. It was then that, at the corner, he saw a boy. Sitting on the ground, with a piece of old bread in his hands, the boy stared at him with big, curious eyes. And that's where it all began. A simple glance. An encounter that, at that moment, seemed insignificant, but would change the fate of everyone. You know that moment when you feel that something important is about to happen, even if you can't explain it? It was exactly like that when Enrique saw that boy at the corner. The boy was small, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with tattered and dirty clothes, clearly marked by time on the streets. He held a piece of bread, biting slowly, as if he wanted it to last as long as possible. Enrique slowed his pace, feeling a mix of curiosity and compassion. But he didn't stop. He walked past, with that uncomfortable thought we all have had, should I help? But how? What can I do? He moved on, but the boy's gaze stayed in his mind. Throughout the journey to work, Enrique found himself thinking, who was he? Where were his parents? How did he end up there? On the way back home, the day was already darkening. Enrique passed the same street, hoping to find the boy again, but he wasn't there. It was only when he turned the next corner that he saw him. The boy was leaning against a wall, as if he were part of it, holding a small plastic bag. "Hey, kid," Enrique called, hesitantly. The boy turned his head quickly, startled. "It's okay, I don't want to scare you. What's your name?" Enrique asked, approaching slowly. The boy looked at him suspiciously, as if he wasn't used to receiving kindness. "Marcos, my name is Marcos." Enrique smiled. "Marcos, are you hungry?" The boy simply nodded, without saying a word. And it was there, on that cold and dark street, that Enrique made the first decision that would change the course of everything. He didn't know how, but he felt he needed to do something. Have you ever had the feeling that a stranger could be the missing piece in your life? Because sometimes, the answer to our problems doesn't come from where we expect, but from where we least imagine. Now imagine the scene: Enrique, a simple man, going home with a boy he barely knew. What would you do in his place? Would you risk opening your home and your life to someone who appeared out of nowhere? Because that's exactly what he did. On the way home, he tried to learn more about Marcos. He found out that his father also lived on the streets, but he hadn't seen him in a long time. His father had a drinking problem and, as he was rarely sober, hardly remembered Marcos. His mother had died about 3 years ago, during the pandemic, so Marcos was forced to live off the help of others on the street. When Enrique opened the door to their home, Marcos stepped in with timid footsteps, holding his small bag as if it were a treasure. He looked around, amazed by the simplicity of the place. For someone who lived on the streets, even a modest house felt like a palace. Milena was in bed, as always, when she heard the sound of the door. She turned her face slowly and saw Enrique accompanied by a skinny boy in worn-out clothes. "Enrique, who is he?" Milena asked, her voice heavy with surprise. Enrique approached and sat beside her, holding her hand. "This is Marcos. I found him on the street. He has no one, Milena. I thought maybe he could stay here for a while." Milena's face hardened. It wasn't anger but a mix of shock and concern. "Enrique, I can hardly take care of myself. How do you expect me to take care of me and a boy?" Enrique took a deep breath. He knew she was right, but he also knew he had to try. "I just want to give him a chance. I really don't understand why, but I feel this very strongly in my heart." Marcos, who had been quiet until then, approached slowly. He held a small piece of paper. "Ma'am, I won't be a bother. I just wanted," he extended the paper, revealing a simple drawing of a flower. "I made this for you." Milena looked at the drawing, and for a moment, something changed in her eyes. It was such a simple gesture, but it brought forth memories of when she used to paint before she got sick. "Even so," Milena said to Enrique, "give this boy a bath, he smells really unpleasant." When the two left the room, Milena kept staring at that somewhat scribbled drawing and, without realizing it, found it amusing. And so, without realizing it, Marcos began to plant the first seeds of something new in that house. A change no one expected. That night, Enrique made a space for Marcos to sleep on the living room sofa. The boy thanked him quietly, and before closing his eyes, he looked at Milena through the slightly open door. You know, sometimes what a person needs is not grand gestures, but a chance. And Marcos, for the first time in a long time, felt that he had found a place where he could start over. Marcos's arrival brought something unexpected to that house. It was as if a spark had illuminated an environment that had been living in the shadows. And you know what's even more curious? Sometimes, the ones we least expect are the ones who make the biggest changes. At first, everything was strange. Milena was still reluctant. She said nothing, but it was evident that she didn't know how to deal with that boy in her home. Marcos did everything he could to not be a nuisance. He helped in any way he could. He cleared the dishes, swept the floor, and even organized Milena's medications on the nightstand next to the bed. Enrique enrolled Marcos in a public school that was very close to their home, and Marcos attended classes in the afternoon, arriving home a little before Enrique got back from work. One day, Enrique returned home and found something he hadn't seen in a long time: Milena laughing. It was a weak laugh, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He stopped at the living room door, unable to believe what he was hearing. Marcos was beside her, holding one of his drawings.
"See, Mrs. Milena? This is you. And this is me, trying to reach the stars."
He pointed to a poorly drawn figure, but full of life. Milena looked at the boy, holding the drawing with trembling hands.
"Do you really think I look like that?" she asked, laughing softly. Marcos shook his head. "Of course. You look like a queen. You just need a crown."
Enrique entered slowly and smiled. "Looks like you two are getting along, huh?" Milena looked at her husband. There was something different in her eyes, as if the usual sadness was being replaced by a timid light. Marcos had no idea, but with every simple gesture, every smile, and every word of hope, he was changing that house. And, more importantly, he was changing Milena. After the diagnosis, Milena had lost the will to live. She was just waiting, and sometimes very impatiently, for the end to come. However, in recent times, there had been more desire to live in Milena. It now seemed important for her to stay alive a little longer. As days went by, Milena began to ask for things she hadn't asked for in a long time. "Enrique, can you help me sit in the chair today? I want to spend some time in the living room with you." Enrique could hardly believe it. The last time Milena had asked to get out of bed was months ago. He helped her carefully, and together they went to the living room. Marcos was sitting at the table, doing his homework. When he saw her, he opened a smile so wide that it seemed to illuminate the entire room.
"Mrs. Milena, come see.
Today at school I made a garden on paper. Just like the one Mr. Enrique said you used to have." Milena looked at the drawing, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the desire to start something anew. Sometimes, life gives us reasons to give up, but all we need is a reason to keep going. And Marcos, with his quiet presence, was giving that reason to Milena. If you've made it this far, you've already noticed how love and small gestures can transform a life.
And you?
Have you thought about the impact you can have on someone's life? If you like this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. Life has a curious way of testing us. Just when we think things are getting better, it throws us a challenge that seems impossible to overcome. And that's exactly what happened in Milena and Enrique's house. A few weeks passed since Marcos arrived, and Milena was more active than ever. She spent her mornings in the living room with Marcos, laughing at his stories and admiring his drawings. Enrique was filled with hope, believing that somehow Marcos had brought a miracle to their family. But on a cold morning, everything changed. Enrique woke up and realized that Milena was different. Her breathing was weak, her gaze distant, and she could barely speak.
"Milena, honey, talk to me."
He held her hand, which was as cold as ice. Marcos, frightened, ran to the room. He looked at Enrique and, for the first time, saw the man who always seemed so strong completely lost. Enrique called the doctor, who arrived quickly. After examining her, he delivered a very sad diagnosis. Milena was facing a severe relapse, and her strength was waning. Imagine the pain of Enrique and Marcos. They had begun to believe in better days, but now everything seemed to crumble again. Then the doctor, Dr. Carlos, told them, "We have an opportunity." Enrique, who had been holding back tears to avoid crying in front of Milena, changed his expression from despair and focused on Dr. Carlos's words. There is an experiment that could be a great opportunity for Milena to have a significant improvement in her condition and life expectancy. It's still very new, and we are not sure if it will work. The tests have been successful with animals, and it has only recently been used on human volunteers. Not everyone has responded positively, but 80% of the patients have responded well to the treatment. What do you think about trying it? Milena was so weak that she could barely say a word, only nodding her head. Then, seeing his wife's reaction, Enrique said, "Let's try it, yes, Dr. Carlos." Dr. Carlos explained all the protocols for the trial, how the treatment would work, and returned the next morning with the paperwork to collect signatures and start the medication. Once a week, a health agent would come to Milena's house to administer the medication, and that's what happened. In the first 2 weeks, Milena showed no improvement, a situation that was discouraging Enrique and Marcos, as they were very hopeful. They had even started a garden for Milena. One night, Enrique sat by Milena's bedside, holding her hand while tears streamed down his face. Marcos was in the living room, alone, holding a drawing he had made especially for her. After a long time, he got up and entered the room. "Mr. Enrique, can I talk to Mrs. Milena?" Enrique nodded, stepping aside to let the boy approach. Marcos sat next to her and, in his sweet voice, began to tell a story. "Mrs. Milena, do you know what I used to do when I was alone on the street and felt sad? I looked up at the sky and imagined my mom. She always told me that the stars were like lights that never went out. I think you are one of those lights." Milena, with great effort, opened her eyes and smiled at him. It was in that moment that Marcos did something simple but powerful. He made her remember that even in darkness, there was light. How many times, in the midst of pain, do we need someone to remind us that there is still hope? Have you ever been that person for someone? Not every battle is won with strength. Some, we win with love. And sometimes, we just need someone to remind us of that. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Milena was still weak, but something in those words from Marcos had touched her soul. Little by little, Enrique and Marcos noticed that she was more present. It wasn't just her body that was fighting, her heart was too. One afternoon, while Marcos was drawing on the living room floor, Milena asked Enrique to help her get out of bed. She wanted to see the little garden that Marcos had begun to take care of. When Enrique turned to get the wheelchair and came back, he was amazed by what he saw. Milena had lifted her body by herself and was sitting next to the bed, a gesture she hadn't been able to do for a long time. It was a moment of great emotion. Enrique began to speak loudly and laugh. The emotion made him laugh and cry at the same time. The treatment was starting to work, and that was wonderful. Still cautious, Enrique took her to the garden, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Marcos ran ahead and pointed to a small flower that had sprouted in the dry earth. "Look, Mrs. Milena. This is the first flower I planted for you." She smiled, her eyes misty, and held the hands of Enrique and Marcos. "You two are my light. Thank you for reminding me of that." Milena improved day by day with the treatment. She had regained autonomy to do many things on her own, but she never walked again. However, they were able to have a more active life and even travel together. Enrique set up a small studio for Milena, where she spent most of her time, and believe it or not, her paintings became a big success. One night, while they were sitting at the table having dinner together, Marcos paused and said he had an important request to make. Both looked at the boy curiously and apprehensively. Enrique then broke the silence, saying, "Just say it, Marcos, what do you want to ask us?" Milena said, "For God's sake, Marcos, don't tell me you want to leave." Then Marcos replied, "Calm down, everyone, it's not that at all. I just wanted to be able to call you Mom and Dad. That would be very important to me." It was then that emotion took over everyone. Enrique said, "Of course, my son," and from that moment on, that family was officially formed. In that house, there were still limits for Milena, but transformative love had one. And sometimes, that's all we need, love and courage to start over. Now tell me, who is your light? Have you thought that you could also be that person for someone? If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs hope.